Narrator, deep, slow tone. Before there was Pakistan, there was pain. A silent kind of pain that lived in the hearts of millions. The pain of being forgotten. Imagine a world where your voice doesn't matter, where your beliefs are questioned, where your culture, your language, your identity are slowly being erased, piece by piece, while the world watches and calls it progress. This was the world the Muslims of the Indian subcontinent lived in. Slight pause, wind sound fades in. They were once rulers, mighty and respected. The architects of cities, the builders of knowledge, the leaders of civilizations. But after centuries of rule, everything changed. The Mughal Empire had fallen, and with it, the pride and power of the Muslims shattered like glass. Under British colonial rule, they became strangers in their own land. Their mosques were empty. Their schools were closed. Their children were lost between two worlds. One that ruled them, and one they no longer owned. Narrator, somber tone. The British didn't just conquer territory. They conquered minds. Their system of education, their laws, their politics, all designed to erase the sense of Muslim identity. And when the British gave Hindus and Muslims equal opportunity, it wasn't really equal. The Muslims, unprepared and unrepresented, began to fade from every institution that once carried their name. Her music deepens, echo of distant voices crowds, faint speeches. The Hindus, educated in the new system, filled government jobs, ran schools, controlled the press, and shaped the political narrative of India. The Muslims, still trying to rebuild their dignity after the collapse of their empire, found themselves, narrator, a soft, reflective tone in it. When a nation loses its identity, it loses its soul. That's what began to happen to the Muslims of the subcontinent, slowly, silently, and painfully. They were not just losing land or power anymore, they were losing themselves. It started in the classrooms. The history that once celebrated their heroes, the rulers, the poets, the thinkers, was replaced with a new version of the past, one that painted them as invaders, as outsiders, as relics of a forgotten age. Their children read lessons that glorified rulers who were not their own, learned languages that were not theirs, and began to dream dreams that did not belong to them. Narrator, gentle but firm tone to the language that had united them for centuries, began to disappear from institutions. Persian, once the symbol of refinement and scholarship, was dismissed as useless. The call for education in English was not wrong, but the price of progress became the erasure of heritage. In the villages and cities alike, Muslims began to feel this weight. They would walk into courts, schools, and offices and feel invisible. The attire that once symbolized pride now drew mockery. The faith that once gave purpose was labeled backward. And every generation that grew up under this system felt a little more detached from the roots that had once defined them. Narrators, somberly, there was a time when the name Muslim meant dignity, a symbol of courage, of knowledge, of justice. But under British rule and Hindu dominance, that name began to sound like a burden. The Hindu press and organizations promoted the idea of a single Indian identity, a one nation, one culture, one language. It sounded noble, but it came with a silent warning that identity would not include Islam. The Muslims' festivals were mocked, their customs dismissed, their leaders ignored. Even in politics, when Muslims tried to speak, their voices were drowned by the majority. Narrated a slower, emotional tone, the loss of identity wasn't just about faith. It was about existence. How can a community survive when its children no longer remember its stories? How can a civilization endure when its people start believing they have no past worth remembering? In homes across India, mothers would whisper to their children about the days of Mughal glory, about Delhi, about Lahore, about scholars and saints. But those whispers faded against the thunder of a new narrative that said, "You are nothing without us," narrated deeper, heavier toned. This loss crept into the spirit of the people. It changed how they walked, how they spoke, how they saw themselves. They began to think small, to accept less, to believe that maybe this was how it was meant to be, that they were destined to serve, not to lead, that they were meant to follow, not to dream. And when a nation stops dreaming, it starts dying. Narrator, a voice steady, reflective for centuries. Islam had been the guiding light for Muslims of the subcontinent, a light that gave them unity even when kingdoms rose and fell. But now, under layers of colonial rule and social humiliation, that light was fading. Some turned away from faith, seeking safety in imitation. Others clung to old traditions, but without direction. And in between stood a generation confused, unsure of who they were or where they belonged. The world around them was changing fast. The British spoke of democracy and equality, but it was a democracy of numbers, and Muslims were outnumbered. The Hindu majority began to dream of an India free from British rule. But in that dream, there was no space for Muslim identity. Narrator, soft, pain toning. What was once home now felt like a stranger's land. Mosques still stood, but the people inside them felt powerless. Markets bustled, but Muslim traders found fewer buyers. Schools opened, but Muslim children had no teachers who understood their soul. The spiritual pride that had built empires was gone, replaced by quiet submission. Even the call to prayer, once a sound of power, now echoed through cities that no longer cared. Narrator, slowly building emotion. But history shows that identity cannot be destroyed, only buried. And under the surface of despair, something was still alive. A question whispered in hearts that refused to give up. Who are we? That question, painful and persistent, began to stir in the minds of thinkers, poets, and scholars. They looked at their people and saw not weakness, but potential, not defeat, but waiting for someone to remind them of who they were. Because when a nation forgets its name, it needs a voice to call it out again. A voice that tells them, you are not lost, you are only asleep. And soon that voice would come. Narrator's calm, steady tone There comes a moment in every nation's story when silence becomes unbearable, when generations who have forgotten how to speak finally remember how to dream again. For the Muslims of the subcontinent, that moment was not sudden. It grew slowly, like the first light of dawn creeping over a dark horizon. It began with realization, a quiet awakening that they were not just a crowd scattered across India. They were a nation asleep under centuries of dust, waiting for someone to call their name. The British had broken their empire, and the Hindu majority had seized the platforms of progress. But even in their humiliation, the Muslims still carried something no conqueror could take: their faith, their culture, their story. They had lost power, yes, but not purpose. All they needed was someone to remind them of it. Narrator says firm, reverent tone. That voice first rose through a man of vision, Sir Syed Ahmad Khan. He saw what others could not. He saw that the Muslims were not dying from poverty alone, but from ignorance. He looked around and realized that the real chains were not made of iron, but of misunderstanding. The Muslims were trapped between pride in their past and fear of their future. He told them something revolutionary for his time, that knowledge was the new weapon of survival. He urged them to learn the language of power, to enter schools, to master science, to understand the law. But most importantly, he reminded them that education without identity was blindness. He didn't want Muslims to copy the West. He wanted them to rise with it. Narrator S. inspired toned through the Mohammedan Anglo-Oriental College in Aligarh. He planted a seed, not just of education, but of awareness. Young Muslims began to see that their future depended on unity and understanding. They started reading, writing, and thinking with purpose again. In those classrooms, discussions were no longer just about history, they were about destiny. Sir Syed's message spread across the land. You are a nation, not a shadow. Those words changed minds. He told Muslims to stop living in the past and start shaping the future. To rebuild their pride through progress, to lift their heads again with knowledge and confidence. Narrator, reflective tone in, but awareness is not built by one man alone. It grows when others take the torch and carry it forward. After Sir Syed came poets, thinkers, and reformers who transformed awakening into movement. And among them, one name rose above all: Allama Iqbal. Iqbal was not just a poet. He was a mirror, showing his people who they had been and who they could become. His poetry was not written for entertainment. It was written for resurrection. He spoke directly to the soul of the Muslim youth, telling them they were eagles meant to soar above mountains, not crows content to live on scraps. Narrator, passionate Tony, through verses like Khudi ko kar biland itna, he taught them self-respect, self-belief, and the courage to dream. He told them, you are not weak, you have just forgotten your strength. In his vision, Islam was not a relic of the past. It was a living force capable of guiding the modern world. He reminded Muslims that their decline was not destiny, it was choice. And choices can change. He warned them that the British might one day leave India, but if the Muslims remained unaware of who they were, they would simply fall under a new kind of slavery. This time, not under foreigners, but under those who denied their right to exist. Narrator softer emotional tone. In his famous Allahabad address of 1930, Iqbal transformed that awareness into a vision. Standing before a hall of political leaders and scholars, he dared to say what many feared even to whisper, that Muslims were not just a minority in India, they were a nation. He declared that the Muslims of northwestern India needed a homeland of their own, where they could live according to their faith and culture, free from domination. That moment was more than politics, it was prophecy. Iqbal had turned the spark of awareness into the flame of purpose. His dream didn't give Muslims something new. It reminded them of what was always theirs: dignity, unity, and destiny. Narrator intense tonic, awareness began to spread like wildfire. In towns and villages, young Muslims recited Iqbal's verses. His poetry became their anthem, his ideas their armor. They began to question, to debate, to challenge the systems that had kept them silent. For the first time in generations, they looked at the future and saw hope instead of fear. Leaders began to rise, teachers, lawyers, students, inspired by this growing consciousness. They spoke not just of independence from British rule, but of independence of the Muslim soul. They demanded education, representation, and unity. The press began to publish Muslim newspapers. Writers began to document their struggles. Mosques and schools became places of discussion and revival. Narrator, slower reflective tone. This was the true rise of awareness, not through guns, but through minds. A revolution of thought that began to shake the foundations of oppression. The Muslims of the subcontinent were no longer lost in despair. They were waking up. They began to see that their survival depended not on submission, but on standing tall. From Sir Syed's pen to Iqbal's poetry, from Aligarh's classrooms to the streets of Lahore, the voice of awakening grew stronger. It was no longer a whisper. It was a movement. The Muslims had begun to remember who they were and what they were meant to become. Narrator, soft, reflective tone. Every great nation begins not with borders or flags, but with a vision. A vision so powerful that it outlives the men who imagine it. For the Muslims of the Indian subcontinent, that vision was not born in a palace or a battlefield. It was born in the heart of a poet, a thinker, a dreamer. Allama Muhammad Iqbal. The Muslims had awakened, but they still stood at a crossroads. They had education, they had awareness, but they had no direction. They knew who they were, but they did not know where they were going. They needed a compass, something that could turn awakening into purpose and purpose into destiny. That compass came in the form of Iqbal's vision, a dream that would change the map of the world forever. Narrator steady, emotional tone, Iqbal saw what others could not. He looked at the condition of the Muslims and realized that no amount of reform or goodwill could protect them in a united India dominated by the Hindu majority. He understood that freedom without identity is another kind of slavery. And so he began to imagine not a rebellion, not a revolt, but a homeland where Muslims could live freely, guided by their own faith, culture, and values. He was not a politician chasing power, he was a philosopher chasing truth. In his poetry, he began to speak of a world faith and progress could walk together, where Islam was not a memory of the past, but a force for the future. He believed that the Muslims of India were a distinct nation, not because of geography or language, but because of their shared belief system, their collective consciousness. Narrators inspired Tony. In 1930, standing before the All India Muslim League in Allahabad, Iqbal spoke words that would echo through history. He declared that the time had come for Muslims to have their own homeland in northwestern India, a place where they could live in harmony with their faith and fulfill their destiny. That speech, known today as the Allahabad Address, was not merely a political demand. It was a moment of revelation. It was the first time someone had given voice to the dream of Pakistan. Iqbal's vision was not built on hate or separation. It was built on justice. He believed in coexistence, but he knew that coexistence without equality leads to oppression. He wanted peace, but peace with dignity. He believed that Islam offered a complete code of life, one that could guide economics, politics, and morality, and that only in an independent homeland could Muslims truly live by those values. A narrator, softer, emotional tone, he wrote, "There is no such thing as a Muslim without Islam." In those words, he captured the essence of his dream. To him, being Muslim was not just about prayer. It was about purpose, identity, and collective progress. He feared that if Muslims continued to live under a Hindu majority system, their culture would disappear. Their youth would lose direction, and their faith would be reduced to ritual. Iqbal's poetry became the voice of that vision. His verses traveled farther than his speeches ever could. They reached the hearts of students, teachers, farmers, and leaders alike. He spoke of Shaheen, the eagle, a symbol of freedom, pride, and elevation. He told the youth that they were not meant to live in chains, that they were born to fly above mountains, to see the world from the height of self, respect, and faith. Narrator rising energy, through his poems, he redefined what it meant to be Muslim in the modern world. He challenged the youth to think, to act, to lead. He said, "Nations are born in the hearts of poets. They prosper and die in the hands of politicians." He knew that ideas come before revolutions, that dreams come before destiny. And his dream was clear: a separate homeland where Muslims could rise once again as a free people, contributing to the progress of humanity under the guidance of faith. Iqbal's vision was not limited to geography. It was spiritual. It was moral. It was about creating a society based on equality, compassion, and justice, values deeply rooted in Islam. He wanted a nation where no one would be judged by caste or wealth, where education would be a right, and where leadership would serve the people, not rule over them. Narrator, thoughtful, calm Tony. Many doubted him. Some thought his dream was impossible. Others feared it would divide India beyond repair. But Iqbal remained firm. He believed that a dream without struggle is just imagination, and a struggle without vision is chaos. He gave the Muslims a reason to struggle, a direction to move, a promise to hold on to. As his words spread across the land, a new kind of hope began to rise. People who once felt invisible began to see themselves as part of something larger, a future worth fighting for. The idea of Pakistan began to take root, not yet as a name, but as a feeling of belonging, of destiny, of divine purpose. Narrator ta gentle, emotional, Iqbal did not live to see Pakistan become a reality, but his vision lived on. In speeches, in hearts, in prayers whispered through nights of uncertainty. His dream had lit a flame that no force could extinguish. And soon, that flame would be carried forward by another man, one who would turn poetry into policy, vision into victory. Narrator, deep, reflective tone. Every vision needs a voice, and every dream needs a leader who can turn it into reality. The Muslims of the subcontinent had woken up. They had rediscovered who they were, and they had begun to believe in the dream that Allama Iqbal had painted for them. But belief alone was not enough. Dreams without direction fade into history. What the Muslims needed now was someone who could transform faith into action, unity into movement, and hope into destiny. That man was Muhammad Ali Jinnah. He was not born into power. He was not raised to rule. He was a lawyer, a man of logic and principle, known for his discipline, dignity, and unmatched integrity. Yet fate had chosen him for something greater. When Iqbal envisioned Pakistan, it was Jinnah who would give it shape. When millions were uncertain, it was Jinnah who would give them confidence. When fear silenced voices, it was Jinnah who would speak for them all. Narrator, steady, admiring Tony. At first, Jinnah believed in a united India where Hindus and Muslims could coexist under equality and justice. He joined the Indian National Congress with that hope, working shoulder to shoulder with leaders who spoke of freedom and democracy. But over time, the truth became painfully clear. The Congress's freedom was not meant for all. The dream of unity was a mirage built on majority rule, and in that vision, the Muslims had no place. When the same leaders who preached liberty began to deny representation to Muslims, when they ignored their demands, their culture, and their voice, Jinnah began to see the deception behind their promises. His faith in the Congress cracked, and his mission changed forever. He realized that Muslims could never survive as a minority in a Hindu-dominated India. They needed independence, not as a favor, but as a right. Narrator se firm commanding tonant. From that realization rose the Quaid-e-Azam, the great leader. Jinnah was no ordinary politician. He was precise in speech, calm in conflict, and unshakable in purpose. He led not with emotion, but with reason. In every meeting, in every negotiation, he fought not with weapons, but with words. Sharp, clear, and unstoppable. He taught the Muslims to believe in themselves again. He told them that their strength did not lie in numbers, but in unity. He said, we're a nation with our own culture and civilization, our own language and literature, our own art and architecture, our own laws and moral codes, our own customs and calendar. Through those words, he reminded Muslims that they were not a minority begging for rights. They were a nation demanding recognition. Narrator, passionate, rising energy, Jinnah's leadership was unlike any other. He was not a man of theatrics. He was a man of principle. His attire was always neat, his voice calm, his arguments disciplined. He never shouted, never begged, never bowed. He believed that dignity was the greatest weapon of all. When others resorted to anger, he used logic. When they used force, he used law. His leadership became the backbone of the Pakistan movement. The All India Muslim League, once small and divided, began to rise under his guidance. He traveled tirelessly across provinces, addressing massive gatherings, speaking to farmers, students, and merchants. His message was simple but powerful. You are one nation. Stand together and no power on earth can stop you. Narrator, emotional Tony. He turned fear into faith. He turned confusion into conviction. People who once doubted themselves began to see strength in their unity. Wherever Jinnah went, crowds followed, chanting his name, not as a politician's slogan, but as a symbol of hope. They saw in him honesty, courage, and clarity. Qualities the world rarely finds in its leaders, and Jinnah demanded the same from his followers. His motto, faith, unity, discipline, was not a slogan to him. It was a code of survival. He believed that without faith, no nation could be born. Without unity, no movement could succeed, and without discipline, no victory could last. Narrator's calm, authoritative. Behind his calm demeanor was a storm of conviction. Every speech he gave was a strike against oppression. Every statement was calculated, deliberate, and decisive. The British and Congress leaders soon realized that Jinnah could not be deceived, divided, or defeated. He was too intelligent to be manipulated and too principled to be bought. He was known as the ambassador of Hindu-Muslim unity once. But when unity became impossible, he became the architect of separation. It was not hatred that drove him, but justice. He wanted a peaceful resolution, but he would not allow peace to come at the cost of his people's freedom. Narrator's reflective Tonin. In every negotiation, Jinnah stood alone, yet never wavered. His health began to fail, but his determination grew stronger. He carried the weight of millions on his shoulders. Muslims from every corner of India who looked to him for guidance, protection, and a future. He was their voice in the halls of power, their defender in the courts of politics, and their hope in the storm of despair. And through all of this, he never lost faith. When others called the dream of Pakistan impossible, Jinnah smiled and said, impossible is a word found only in the dictionary of fools. Narrator softer, emotional Tony. He knew the path ahead would be filled with obstacles, division, opposition, and sacrifice. But he also knew that a dream this pure could not be destroyed by fear. The vision that Iqbal had imagined now had a leader who could shape it into reality. The Muslims had found their guide, their defender, their Quaid. And under his leadership, the dream of Pakistan began to move from the realm of imagination, narrator, deep, solemn tone. Every freedom is born in struggle. Every nation that breathes in independence must first walk through the fire of sacrifice. For the Muslims of the subcontinent, that fire burned for decades. It wasn't the fire of war. It was the fire of injustice, silence, and unshakable determination. It was the kind of struggle that tests not just the body, but the soul of a people. When Quaid-e-Azam Muhammad Ali Jinnah took the lead, the dream of Pakistan had a direction, but the road ahead was filled with mountains of opposition. The British Empire, still clinging to its power, refused to accept a separate homeland. The Indian National Congress called the idea of Pakistan madness. A division of the land they believed was theirs alone. The media mocked it. The elites dismissed it. Even some Muslims doubted it. But Jinnah and his followers knew one truth: that freedom never comes as a gift, it must be earned. Narrator as firm, rising energy. The struggle began in the halls of politics, but soon spilled into the hearts of the people. Jinnah transformed the Muslim League from a weak organization into a thunderous movement. Village after village, town after town, he carried his message. Oh, we are one nation, and our destiny is freedom. The Muslims, long ignored in India's politics, found their voice again. They filled streets, attended rallies, and waved the green flag as a symbol of hope. They were not fighting for power or wealth. They were fighting for survival, for the right to live with dignity, to pray freely, to raise their children in their own identity. Narrator's emotional Tony. The Congress leaders spoke of democracy, but their democracy was built on numbers. And numbers were not in the Muslims' favor. Every proposal for equal representation was rejected. Every demand for protection of Muslim rights was mocked. It became clear that in a united India, Muslims would forever remain a voiceless minority. And so, the struggle deepened. The press began to attack the idea of Pakistan, calling it division and destruction. But for Jinnah, it was creation, the creation of balance, justice, and identity. He stood unshaken, even as critics called him stubborn, rigid, or delusional. He was not moved by their insults. He was moved only by his mission. Narrator, steady, passionate Tony. From 1937 onward, the Muslim League's message began to resonate across India. Young people joined the cause with fire in their hearts. Muslim women, who had long been confined to their homes, came forward, organizing, speaking, and mobilizing. Students in Aligarh, Lahore, and Karachi turned universities into centers of awakening. The call for Pakistan began to echo in every gathering, every home, every prayer. And then came 1940, the moment that would define the struggle forever. On March 23rd, in the city of Lahore, millions gathered under one flag. They came from every corner of India. Rich and poor, young and old, united by one purpose. There, the historic Lahore Resolution was passed. The formal demand for a separate homeland for Muslims. The world would later call it the Pakistan Resolution. Narrator soft, reflective tongue. That day, something changed forever. Pakistan was no longer a dream whispered in poetry. It became a political reality written into history. It was no longer a wish. It was a demand backed by millions of hearts that refused to bow. But with that declaration came greater trials. The British grew uneasy. The Congress grew hostile. They accused Jinnah of dividing India. But Jinnah stood firm, saying, "We do not seek division. We seek survival." He reminded the world that Muslims were not asking for someone else's land. They were asking for their own place under the sun. Narrator, rising emotion. As the struggle intensified, sacrifices multiplied. Entire families dedicated their lives to the cause. People sold their homes to fund the movement. Young men left their studies to organize rallies. Women stitched flags and spread messages from door to door. The cry of Pakistan Zindabad began to rise in the air like a storm. It was no longer just a slogan. It was a prayer, a promise, a heartbeat that united millions. The British tried to delay freedom, to divide the Muslims, to weaken their spirit. But Jinnah's discipline was unbreakable. He told his followers to remain peaceful, to fight with patience, not violence. He believed that moral strength was the greatest weapon of all. Narrator somber, deep tone. The years of 1942 to 1945 tested every believer in the dream. The world was at war and India was unstable. The Congress launched its Quit India movement, demanding freedom for themselves, but ignoring the Muslims' voice once again. Jinnah's response was clear. If you want freedom, then so do we. But ours is not the same as yours. He, narrator, that deep, reflective tone. History has a strange way of testing those who dare to dream. It breaks them, bends them, and pushes them to the edge. And only when they refuse to give up does it reward them with triumph. For the Muslims of the subcontinent, that triumph came not easily, not quickly, but through rivers of patience, tears, and sacrifice. And when it finally came, it was more than a political victory. It was the rebirth of a nation. As the 1940s unfolded, the movement for Pakistan had grown into a tidal wave that could no longer be contained. The world was changing. The Second World War had shaken empires and exposed the fragility of British rule. The promise of self-determination echoed everywhere. But for Muslims, self-determination was not a distant dream. It was a sacred cause. They were no longer pleading to exist. They were demanding to live as free people. Narrator, steady, emotional tone. The struggle had taken its toll. Generations had marched, organized, and suffered. Countless had faced prison, poverty, and persecution. But under Jinnah's unwavering leadership, the Muslim League stood united. It had become more than a political party. It was the heartbeat of an entire nation in waiting. The British could see it. The Congress could feel it. The idea of Pakistan had grown too powerful to suppress. By 1946, elections were held, and the results spoke louder than any speech. The Muslim League swept the Muslim seats across India. It was not just a victory at the ballot box. It was a referendum of the heart. Every vote cast for the League was a declaration: we are one people, and our destiny is Pakistan. It was the moment the world finally had to accept that the Muslims were not a scattered minority. They were a nation awakening to its destiny. Narrators firm, rising toned. But the road to freedom was still paved with chaos. The British government, desperate to exit India, tried to negotiate one last time. Congress leaders offered half measures, demanding a single India where Muslims would be protected. But the Muslims had learned from centuries of false promises. Protection was not freedom. Equality without power was illusion. Jinnah stood before the British and declared, we are a nation and we demand the right to live as a nation. Negotiations turned into confrontations. Plans were made and discarded, hopes rose and fell. But the Muslims refused to step back. Their unity was their shield. Their faith was their strength. As the pressure built, so did their resolve. Every speech by Jinnah became a call to endurance. Every rally became a reminder that freedom was near. Narrator emotional, steady Tony, and then came the turning point, the decision that would change history forever. The British, exhausted and overwhelmed, realized that India could not remain united. The dream of a single India had collapsed under the weight of its own contradictions. On June 3, 1947, the plan for partition was announced. India would be divided and Pakistan would be born. The news spread like lightning. In the streets, in villages, in schools and mosques, the air was filled with disbelief and joy. People wept, laughed, prayed. Generations that had lived under foreign rule could finally see the horizon of freedom. After centuries of silence, a nation was about to speak in its own voice. Narrators, softer, emotional toned. But victory came with heartbreak. The partition unleashed chaos across the land. Millions were forced to leave their homes, traveling across new borders, marked not by ink, but by blood. Families were divided, lives were lost, cities burned. The soil that was meant to unite them became the witness of tragedy. Yet even in that suffering, the spirit of Pakistan refused to die. For every life lost, thousands more stood up, carrying the flag forward with tears and pride. Narrator, slow, powerful Tony, and then the dawn of August 14, 1947, a date etched in eternity. As the first rays of sunlight touched the new homeland, the world saw a miracle unfold. Against every prediction, against every obstacle, the dream had become reality. Pakistan had come to life. In Karachi, the air was electric with emotion. Crowds gathered, shouting, "Pakistan Zindabad!" The green and white flag rose into the sky for the first time, its crescent and star glimmering like a promise kept. The anthem had not yet been written, but the people's voices filled the air with something greater. Gratitude, faith, and unity. Muhammad Ali Jinnah, frail yet unbreakable, stood as the father of a newborn nation. In his eyes was not pride, but responsibility. He knew that the struggle had only shifted from creation to preservation. Yet in that moment, as the world watched, he had fulfilled what many had called impossible. Narrator, steady, reverent tone. Pakistan was not born out of hatred, but out of hope. It was not carved from ambition, but from necessity. The necessity to protect a way of life, a belief system, and a cultural identity. It stood as proof that a nation could be created not through conquest, but through conviction. The Muslims of the subcontinent had written their destiny with patience and prayer, not with the sword. That day, when the clock struck midnight and the world map changed, millions looked up to the sky and whispered a single word, Pakistan. For them, it was more than a country. It was a sanctuary, a dream fulfilled by the grace of faith, unity, and sacrifice. Narrator, soft, lingering tone. The night of freedom was filled with light, but also with memory. The memory of those who had not lived to see this day. The memory of those who had carried the dream through darkness. The world witnessed not just the creation of a nation, but the triumph of belief. Belief that no matter how long the struggle, truth always finds its dawn. Narrator, a deep, calm tune. The story of Pakistan did not end on August 14, 1947. That day was only the beginning. The dream that had been born from centuries of struggle was not a destination, but a journey built on faith, carried by hope, and written in the sacrifices of millions. The flag that rose above Karachi that morning was not just cloth and color. It was a symbol of a promise, a vow to live free, to live united, and to build a nation worthy of the price that had been paid. In the days following independence, there was no calm after the storm. The land was divided, the people scattered, and chaos lingered like a shadow over the newborn country. Trains arrived at stations filled with refugees, men, women, and children who had left everything behind except faith in a new beginning. The cities overflowed, hospitals struggled, and food was scarce. But even in that hardship, there was a strange and powerful light, the light of unity. Narrator, emotional, rising tonant. From Karachi to Lahore, from Peshawar to Dhaka, people rebuilt with their bare hands. They slept on roadsides, shared what little they had, and looked after one another as one family. The rich and poor stood side by side because for once they all shared the same story. They were Pakistanis. That unity, born out of suffering, became the foundation of the nation's identity. It was a silent promise made by the people to their homeland. We will make it rise. Muhammad Ali Jinnah, though frail and exhausted, moved through the early days of Pakistan with quiet determination. He visited refugee camps, addressed officials, and reminded everyone that independence was not the end of their duty. His speeches were not of victory, but of responsibility. He said, "You are free. You are free to go to your temples, your mosques, or any other place of worship. You may belong to any religion or caste. That has nothing to do with the business of the state." Those words carried the soul of his vision, a nation of peace, justice, and equality. Narrator steady, reflective tone. But building a nation is harder than dreaming one. Pakistan began its life without proper resources, without stable governance, and with wounds that still bled from partition. Government offices had no paper, ministries had no staff, and even the national anthem had yet to be composed. Yet the people refused to surrender to despair. They built schools in tents, opened hospitals in abandoned buildings, and sang songs of hope in the face of chaos. The early years tested the resilience of this new identity. The leaders who had fought side by side for independence were now tasked with shaping a country from dust. The challenges were immense. Economic instability, displaced populations, and political confusion. Yet through every hardship, one thing remained unbroken: the belief that this land was chosen, that its birth carried divine purpose. Narrator, emotional tone, soft pause. Pakistan was more than territory. It was an idea that faith could be the foundation of freedom, that justice could rise where once there was oppression, that a people once silenced could now speak their truth. The world watched in disbelief as a nation, written off by skeptics as unsustainable, began to stand tall. The youth who had marched with green flags in the struggle for independence became the builders of a new tomorrow. Scientists, teachers, soldiers, and poets all found purpose in the same mission: to honor the dream that had united their ancestors. And though progress was slow, the spirit of resilience never faded. Each generation inherited not just land, but a sacred story. The story of how a dream became destiny. Narrator S. inspired tone, slower rhythm in. Jinnah's words echoed beyond his lifetime. He had said, "Work, work and work, and we are bound to succeed." Those words became the anthem of a struggling people determined to carve their future with their own hands. Factories began to rise, schools reopened, and cities that had once been silent came alive with ambition. But even as Pakistan found its footing, it faced storms, political turbulence, wars, divisions, and internal challenges that shook its core. Yet through it all, one truth remained constant: Pakistan was built by those who refused to give up. Every time the nation stumbled, its people stood taller. Every crisis became a test of unity, and every setback reminded them of the sacrifices that had brought this homeland into existence. Narrators, soft, reflective tone today, when one looks back at the journey, from the despair of colonization to the triumph of independence, one cannot help but feel awe. The creation of Pakistan was not a coincidence of history. It was a miracle of faith. It was the triumph of belief over fear, of unity over division, of identity over erasure. The legacy of those who dreamed of Pakistan still breathes in every prayer, every flag, every heart that calls this land home. The promise of Pakistan was never just about borders. It was about values, unity, faith, discipline. It was about building a nation where justice would prevail, where opportunity would belong to all, and where freedom would not be a privilege, but a birthright. The dream was not merely to create a state, but to create a model for the world, a place where humanity and faith walk hand in hand. Narrator's deep, heartfelt tone. The torch now lies in the hands of the generations that follow. The same torch carried by those who crossed rivers of fire in 1947. The same light that guided the footsteps of Jinnah and his companions. The question that remains is not whether Pakistan was worth the struggle that has been answered by history itself. The question is whether the promise that built Pakistan still burns within us. The dream that gave birth to Pakistan was never meant to fade. It was meant to grow, to inspire, to remind every generation that freedom is not inherited. It must be protected, nourished, and honored. It calls upon every heart that beats under the green and white flag to remember that this nation was not given. It was earned with courage, with sacrifice, and with the belief that a people united by faith can shape the course of destiny itself.